Good morning. My name is Hermann Pretorius. I'm the head of strategic communications for the South African Institute of Race Relations, the IRR, a think tank established almost 100 years ago in 1929 to make the case for a non-racial, prosperous South Africa. In other words, a country that is economically and politically free. There's no question about what South Africans want. A decade of polling by the Institute has shown time and time again that across all boundaries of division that we hear so much about, there's a consensus that South Africa has a jobs crisis. Ordinary people want jobs. But part of this crisis is, of course, the ability to do those jobs, to be productive in a competitive economy. We hear so much about what's gone wrong in South Africa, and there is a lot to diagnose. And today's presentation will, of course, delve into that diagnosis. But what is more exciting, for me at least, about today's presentation and the publication we are launching, is that it forms part of the IRR's internationally recognized Blueprint for Growth paper series. These papers make the case for growth in South Africa and how it can be achieved, how 7% GDP growth can be achieved within a decade, bringing with it an upward momentum of socio-economic upliftment. And of course, the be-all and end-all of dignity, of participation, in terms of economic participation, is the ability to compete, get, and do a job, an honest job for an honest income. And that is why today's paper, today's presentation, written by our head of policy research, Dr. Anthea Jeffery, is so important, because it forms part of the vision of what South Africa can be. And that is a country of real freedom and real prosperity. And part of that picture, part of that route to success, is the question of how do we solve our jobs crisis? How do we solve our skills crisis? This is an issue that will lie at the heart of our future as a country. And we are proud from the Institute side to make these policy proposals freely available. If you enjoy these policy proposals and today's presentation, please visit the IRR's website, where you can become a member of Team What SA Can Be, the IRR's mission to take these policy proposals and make them real, make them tangible, go upstream from politics so that the solutions become actual, not just in the sense of being passed in Parliament, but getting buy-in from the moderate middle of South Africans, the majority who want to see this country really work in every sense of the word. With that introduction done, I'll hand over to Anthea Jeffery, the author of this paper. I will let her go through the presentation with the remarkable insights there to share. And once she's done, I will return to this online studio to chair the question and answer session. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Anthea, thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Herman, and thanks to all those who are attending today. I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk about this extraordinarily important issue of how we generate more jobs and more skills in South Africa. So we have an agenda which will range from our disappointment, I think, that many feel with the GNU and our current jobs numbers, through to some of the things we can do about it, whether it is reforming labour laws, or trying to unleash the sectors which have long been labor-intensive, such as agriculture and mining and retail, and then looking to the problem of generating better skills. What can we do about our failing TVET colleges? What about the setters that are supposed to provide skills too? What about our universities and how well are they doing? And then the key question too, why is it that we're not using all our available skills, and what can be done in that sphere? So let's look first to the GNU. And of course, it's been more than a year since the Government of National Unity was formed in July last year, amid, I think, really very high hopes that this would be a new page in South Africa's history. And of course, the potential for that is always there. 10 parties were agreed on 2 priorities in particular: the need for inclusive growth, the need for many more jobs. As Hermann says, this is the priority which South Africans themselves identify over and over again as the key issue they want the government to tackle. And skills, of course, are also important if people are to be able to move into employment. The ANC lost its majority in the 2024 election with 40%, and so the baton has passed to the GNU. But we know now that the ANC is resisting this, that it wants to act as if it never lost its majority at all, that it's still intent on pursuing a national democratic revolution with crippling consequences for the economy, and that it is really trying to pull the GNU partners along with it in this endeavor. But as anger at the ANC grows, and I think we know that that is happening, there really is a call for the GNU to take charge. It has a key duty to all the people that helped vote it into power to make sure that the policies that it adopts do attain those key goals, inclusive growth and many more jobs. What are we doing so far in these contexts? Their growth rate in 2024, which is the last year for which we have complete figures, was 0.8% of GDP. And of course, we only had the GNU for half of that time. But it was a very disappointing figure, particularly because the population of South Africa grew by 1.3% in that time. So our economy is growing more slowly than our population. And for this year, we have some figures, but they indicate again a meager rate of growth. And the prospects of our getting to a 3% rate of GDP growth are really diminishing all the time. The upshot has been that unemployment has gone up a bit, whereas we wanted it to go down. In the second quarter of 2025, it stood at 33.2%, almost half a percentage point up on what it had been in the first 3 months of the year. That's on the official definition, which counts only those who are actively looking for jobs. If we look to the expanded definition, which also takes account of discouraged workers who've given up the search for jobs, then the unemployment rate is an even higher 42.9%. And if we look at youth, at young people between the ages of 15 and 24, then it's the staggering 62.4%. For a bit of context, it's worth looking at how we compare with our co-BRIC members. And here I'm looking at the original 4 rather than the expanded BRICS. And these figures come from the fourth quarter of 2024, so the end of last year. What do they show? Brazil in the 6% range, Russia, despite fighting the war, at 2.3%, India also in the 6% range, and China in the 5% range. The difference between these numbers and our numbers is staggering. And if we look to some other countries too, Vietnam at 2.2%, Mexico at 2.8%, that again just confirms that we're an extraordinary outlier. And the amount of suffering that is involved for individuals at these levels of unemployment is really, I think, unimaginable. There are 8.4 million people unemployed on the strict definition, roughly 12 million on the expanded one. So to overcome our unemployment crisis is not only an economic and a political imperative, it's also a moral one. And we absolutely need it for greater social cohesion and stability within the country. What are the number of jobs we need? If we're ready to bring down joblessness to below 10%, then we need 900,000 net new jobs a year. This would mop up the currently unemployed and make provision for new entrants to the labor market. But unfortunately, we've only been generating some 240,000 net new jobs a year over the past 20 years. Sorry, there's an error in the slides there. It's a year, not a total. But most of these jobs were created when growth was above 3% of GDP. So growth at the rate of 1% of GDP is grossly inadequate if we're going to have the million more jobs that we need. And what we really need is to have growth at 7% of GDP, because that would double the size of the economy every 10 years. By contrast, if we manage to edge our growth rate up to 1.3% of GDP, which many people assume we would be able to achieve this year, the size of our economy would double only in 54 years. That's not nearly enough. We need the higher growth. Only on that basis can we start getting to the number of jobs that we need. But we also have to look at the other barriers which hold back the generation of more jobs. And a key barrier is to be found in our very rigid and often coercive labor laws. And I can't touch on all of them. I'm going to deal with only a couple. The first is the National Minimum Wage Act, which was introduced in 2018, came into force in 2019. Initially, the national minimum wage set was 20 Rand an hour. It's gone up since then. If you think of a person working pretty much a full-time month, then the minimum wage that's now required is 4,840 Rand a month. And to employ anybody at less than that is illegal. And yet, there are many unskilled and inexperienced people, young people in particular, who simply are not worth that kind of wage. It seems a shocking thought, but that is the reality, and the government is aware of it, which is why President Cyril Ramaphosa had said that employers incur a loss when they take on the unskilled and the inexperienced, and they have to pay them more than they are worth. We also know that there are very many people who would be happy to work for less than the national minimum wage, because having some income is very much better than having no income, and that our national minimum wage is unusually high compared to our median wage. In most countries, you never get a national minimum wage which is pitched at more than 55% of the median wage, and generally it's much lower than that. But our national minimum wage is pitched, according to certain research, at 76% of our median wage, which is partly why it's so very difficult for people to comply with it, and why so many people are in fact working illegally and their jobs are vulnerable. And we've had the loss, according to a colleague of mine, Gabriel Krauser, of roughly 430,000 jobs since the national minimum wage came in. So it's doing the opposite of what we want. Instead of helping to price people into jobs, it's helping to exclude them from the labor market. So we believe that we should scrap the national minimum wage for now. It's inappropriate in a country with such a high level of unemployment. At the very least, we should reduce it to what the government pays on its expanded public works program, where the NMW is set at considerably less, at 15.83 an hour or 127 a day. And there are other exceptions that could be found. For example, in our special economic zones, we could again scrap the national minimum wage, and that would become an incentive for more companies to invest and employ in those zones. We need to reform labor laws in other ways as well, because there are many dismissals which are seen as automatically unfair, either because of the reason for which they've been implemented, or because employers are unable to prove that they have the reason they used is a fair one and the procedure that they've adopted has been fair too. And because the onus lies on the employer to show these things, it's very easy for employees to refer disputes to the CCMA, the Commission for Conciliation, Mediation and Arbitration, which is now thoroughly overwhelmed with a number of labor disputes that it has to deal with, many of them dismissals, but many other things too. And in the end, often decisions on dismissals and whether they are fair or not are made by arbitrators, who may often get things wrong, but their decisions are not easy to set aside on judicial review, because it's not enough to show that the decision is incorrect. You also have to be able to show that no reasonable arbitrator could have made that decision on the evidence available to him or her, which is not an easy test. Even where judicial review is available, we find that the labor courts are overburdened too. So, for example, in Johannesburg, there are 6 courtrooms trying to deal with a backlog of a caseload which amounts to 4,000 cases. And the labor court judges are thoroughly overwhelmed too. The judge president has complained that they have to try and write judgments in their recesses over the weekend. He has said that the whole system is increasingly overburdened with disputes and that it's time to look again at the Labour Relations Act. Employers, of course, will always be reluctant to hire if they can't fire when this is needed, either because somebody does turn out to be unsuitable or because in this kind of struggling economy there isn't sufficient demand for the goods and services the business is producing, and it needs to reduce its staff if it's to survive. So what we should also do is to return to the common law rule, in terms of which termination of employment can take place under the agreed notice periods which are contained in employment contracts. People enter into an employment contract by agreement, and then they stick to their agreement when it comes to a dismissal. And an employee, who wants to allege that a dismissal is unfair still has the option of doing so, but he or she would then bear the onus of proof, which is the normal rule under the common law. We also want to be able to unleash the sectors which have long been labour intensive and which do have the potential to grow. And it's especially important to look at sectors which are tradable, in the sense that they're able to export into other countries and so don't have to rely on the domestic market alone. And agriculture is one such sector. It has a very valuable number of exports, which rose to $13.2 billion in 2023. It contributes 3.5% of GDP. It employed 930,000 people in June 2025. And it has great potential for expansion. According to Wandile Seklobo, an agricultural economist, it could grow by 15 to 30% if only we could overcome key barriers to growth. And he lists things such as energy shortages and costs, enormous problems we have with logistics, with the trains, the roads, and the ports, major issues of crime, particularly in rural areas, and increasing problems also now with water, partly supply, because water that we already have is becoming contaminated as sewage plants break down. Also because something like the Lesotho Highlands Water Project, which is supposed to be delivering water already to large parts of the country, has been long delayed. Also because the security of water use rights is now also being eroded under proposed laws that would make it very difficult for most commercial farmers to obtain water use rights. We also have an Expropriation Act, the Act of 2024, which was gazetted in January this year, though it's not yet been brought into force. And under it, the state seems to envisage that there will be considerable expropriation of rural land so that this can be handed in some way to emergent farmers. And yet the state has 2.5 hectares of land in its control, which is mostly underutilized. And the very sad thing too is that between 50 and 90% of transferred land has become unproductive. So the more we speed up the transfer of land, the more risk there is that we will end up with more assets dying in the hands of the poor. This is what a Director General of Land Reform, Tosi Ngwanya, said back in 2007. None of the problems which were causing this situation have been resolved. So it really is not sensible to forge ahead with more land transfers and run this risk. Instead, a better aim would be to increase the number of successful farmers of all races. That would be good for the country, and it would be good for all the individuals concerned. Whereas setting farmers up to fail, which is what is happening now, is not good. So we should amend the Expropriation Act of 2024, bring it into line with the Constitution, which is, of course, in itself an imperative, make sure that it doesn't provide any more for nil compensation, that the compensation provided is always adequate, and that we use expropriation as an instrument of last resort, which is the way it should always be used. And we look to other ways to ensure farmers do have secure property rights, which give them the confidence to invest and to expand and to generate the many more jobs that could be generated in that sector with the right policies. We also need to get mining going. Mining, of course, has been the bedrock of the South African economy for decades, and we have an enormous treasure house of minerals. But at the same time, the mining sector has been, to some degree, in trouble because its contribution to GDP is falling. It's now about 8%. The number of jobs it provides is falling rather than growing. It's very much down on exploration spending, which is the lifeblood of the industry, in order to sustain it going into the future. We used to attract 5% of global exploration spend. Now we get less than 1%, simply not enough. And we're falling down the ranks of the Fraser Institute's Global Miner Index, which is a highly respected barometer of the attractiveness of different mining countries. And on the last report brought out in 2024, South Africa fell again. We're now at 68th position out of 82 countries. We're behind a country even such as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a war-torn country, which scored above us at 58th out of 82. And we're way behind countries like Botswana at 20th position on the index. And we need truly to be able to overcome all the barriers that have seen us constantly go down on the index instead of going up. One of the barriers is the Mineral, Petroleum Resources and Development Act of 2002. This came into force in 2004. At that point, all the mineral resources beneath the ground were vested in the custodianship of the state, and the government has used its increased powers to impose ever more onerous BEE and other obligations on the mining industry, to the point that many now see the industry as uninvestable. On top of that, we have a new mining bill, which was brought out in May 2025 by Gwede Mantashe, and which will make the problem even worse, because it will empower the minister to impose yet more BEE requirements of a very onerous nature. It will vastly increase the number of penalties provided for under legislation, from 1, not putting in the right information, to 16, including not adequately implementing your BEE obligations. And it threatens to put directors of companies in jail for 10 years for offences of that kind. So it's quite clear, as many commentators have said, that the bill will deter investment even more. We also need to overcome other barriers, the energy shortfalls, the logistics problems, particularly the rail and the ports. You can't get your manganese to port, you can't get your coal to port, and so on. There's still no cadastre system, though this has been promised for many years. And there's been an upsurge in illegal mining, which the government seems to have really no concept of how to tackle, except perhaps by trying to encourage people to turn to artisanal mining instead. But that seems very unlikely to solve the problem. What are the reforms needed? Particularly, we need to scrap the mining bill because it will make things that much worse. And we need to reform the NPRDA. We really should be following Botswana's very clear and transparent mining law, which has served that country very well, which puts it in 20th position out of the 82, monitored by the Fraser Institute this year. And South Africa, with its much greater mineral endowment, could do far better than Botswana if we had the right mining laws. And of course, we have to overcome the other barriers too. The retail sector is one which absorbs a great number of people, and it also has the great capacity to expand. And we have, of course, giants of retail, household names with which we are all familiar. But we also have a very vibrant informal sector and large numbers of informal traders and other businesses, which Gigi Alcock, who's been monitoring this issue for years, sees as turning over billions of rands a year and being really a very powerful foundation for the growth of jobs for so many more people, if only this sector too can be helped to grow. So we also need businesses which are currently illegal to formalize it, but to formalize and become legal, but we need to do it in the right way. We need to lighten regulation. South Africa has an extraordinary degree of regulation at all 3 spheres of government, which is out of sync with most other developing countries. And we need to make sure that red tape works. Whatever regulation is left must be efficiently implemented. And we all know that many of our organs of state, our municipalities, are becoming so dysfunctional that efficiency is the exception rather than the norm. We need to provide appropriate infrastructure. Informal traders have said that they need things like better lighting and ablution facilities and lock-up storage, which you can imagine how helpful that would be, and access to Wi-Fi. SARS is very well aware that there's untapped revenue in this informal trading, but we need to proceed carefully there, using tax amnesties and other measures, a sort of slow process of enticing people into formalization rather than frightening them off with heavy tax bills. But one thing that really needs to be tackled is what might be called the rent boycott, which began in the 1980s, under which people decline, even though they could afford to do it, to pay their rates and their water bills and their electricity bills and so on. And it's extraordinary how much that municipal debt has risen. It currently stands at 416 billion, up from about 315 billion last year. And of the 416 total, households owe about 300. And many of those households may well also be running these informal businesses, but increasingly now suffering as the infrastructure collapses, as we don't have water, we don't have electricity, we don't have adequate sanitation. And the municipalities need the money to be able to do better, though they need many other things, of course, an end to cadre deployment and many more sensible rules that would also reduce the scope for corruption. Another possibility, which Gigi Alcock mentions, is to facilitate trade with vendors from Africa. If there was easier transport here and back again, if there were fewer border controls, not only our border with Zimbabwe, but throughout the continent, you could again have an increased market with people coming to buy here and then take back to their own countries. Very much we need to generate better skills, because one of the increasing problems we face is that business says that the job entrants that it now sees are often, they say, unemployable, untrainable, because they are functionally illiterate and innumerate. And that's an extraordinary failure on the part of the school system. And even those who have not dropped out, and there are large numbers that do, but do manage to achieve a national senior certificate, are still often functionally illiterate and innumerate. And that's because 80% of the schools are dysfunctional, and we know that more than 80% of children at grade 4 level can't read for meaning in any language. And so a lot of their subsequent education simply passes them by. But South Africa is not alone in having this kind of problem. There are other countries, India, Kenya, Nigeria, and so on, where again you have education which is often free in the public schools, but it's very bad. The teachers seem to be indifferent to how often or how well they teach. They're protected by labor law, they're protected by powerful unions, and they're protected by funding rules under which revenue flows to the schools year after year, irrespective of whether they do badly or well. So we need schools, both public and private, to be competing for the custom of parents, and we can achieve this by means of tax-funded school vouchers. And the vouchers would cover teacher salaries and school expenses, and they would follow pupils to the schools of their choice. So to explain a bit more, at the moment, of course, all the tax revenue for basic schooling goes to public schools without regard to their performance. But it would be possible for the government to work out how many children are in low-income families, and then to say, well, per capita, we're spending that much on these children, and then set aside that amount and divide it up among the parents of those children as tax-funded vouchers. And the parents would then be able to choose what school they want their child to go to. And immediately, all public schools would have incentives to compete for the custom of those parents. You would also see low-cost private schools springing up, as they have in Nairobi, in parts of India, in Lagos, because parents are so worried about the free but ineffective public schools that they're looking for alternatives. And entrepreneurs would see the opportunity too, once parents are equipped with vouchers. All of this is set out in a paper that came out last year, and an update will soon be provided. We also need to do a great deal to improve our technical vocational education and training colleges, because they are really crucial in providing the skills which are essential in an industrialized society, and we don't have enough of them. The aim is to get to 2.5 million students by 2030, but at present, as the HERE Commission said, we only have about 2% of our youth cohort in technical education, whereas the norm is 6% in industrialized countries. And if you look across to the other side of the screen, you'll see comments by the HERE Commission, which was appointed in 2017 to advise on the funding of tertiary education, and delved into the performance of the TVET colleges and what could be done to improve them, and noted that the system is currently skewed towards university education and that it will not self-correct. He also said we have to take the steps that will make TVET colleges attractive institutions of choice, that this will be better for the country and it will also be better for the students, because technical and vocational skills are in high demand and people who have them should more easily find jobs. But currently the throughput rates in TVET colleges are very poor, and this is for any number of reasons, including the fact that we have bad TVET lecturers, often people with inadequate subject knowledge and also with poor pedagogical skills. We have outdated curricula not geared to the needs of a rapidly changing economy, and there's far too little practical training involved in the courses. What can we do? Well, what HERE recommended was that we should have fee-free TVET colleges with all expenses for students covered, that this is the most critically important need in his view. And if we look to the other side of the slide, we can see some of the problem that he uncovered. The rule at the time that he was writing, 2017, was that the state would cover 80% of tuition fees at TVET colleges. The reality was that they just didn't make that money available. So they were in practice covering 53% of the fees at TVET colleges, and the TVET colleges were just increasingly being squeezed by not receiving enough money from the state. So his recommendation is that they should indeed get that 80%, but there should also be money from NSFAS, which would cover all the other expenses of TVET students, which would cover accommodation and daily stipends and transport costs and everything, and that this would be an investment for the state to make, which would be well worth making. But Zuma's educational plan was different. He does think that TVET colleges should be given considerable support, but actually it's not as much as at universities. And the big problem is that he wanted to do it for everyone, for not only TVET colleges, but also for universities. And that simply is not affordable. South Africa has too high public debt, too little growth, too little tax revenue. We cannot manage this as well. And the irony is that when Zuma announced the system in 2017 and it came into force in 2018, the Treasury introduced a 1 percentage point increase in VAT, which meant effectively that very poor people were now paying for the fee-free education of students at universities primarily, and also only partly at TVET colleges. What we also need to do is to scrap our very inefficient setters. We have 21 of them. They were established in 1998. They're funded by an employer levy for approved training, and they provide both for learnerships for people who are not yet employed and for on-the-job training. And the idea is a strange one. Instead of trusting it to employers to know what training is needed, the idea was that the government would set up this top-down centralized system where a setter in every sector would decide what employers in that sector needed. And some of these sectors are very large. The needs of different employers across the sector vary widely. And the setters have always done a very bad job at identifying the skills which are needed. And they also have done a very bad job at increasing throughput. And the quality of the training that they provide is often poor. So businesses get very little value for the setter levies that they pay, which were 21 billion a year a little while ago, are expected to be 26 billion a year in the current financial year. And effectively, they end up paying twice. They just pay the SETA levy, see it as a tax, and then they get on with paying as much as they can for the training that they actually need, which they determine for themselves. There's also considerable corruption in many SETA procurement contracts. This has been monitored, for example, by ARTA over the last 3 years. It's been looking at 3 SETAs in particular and has been appalled by the extent of inflated pricing and so on, which has come to light. There's a recent Bureau for Economic Research report which has just come out, which indicates that there's a great deal of inflation in the wages paid to SETA staff as well, even though they don't do very much. There's been a recent scandal over a kind of ANC cadre deployment to SETA boards implemented by the last Minister of Higher Education and Training, Nabukhle Nkabanda, who chose Gwede Mantashe's son, for example, to sit on a SETA board. And because other ANC luminaries were selected too, it really smacked of cadre deployment. And when she then lied about how she'd got to the names, she was fired by Mr. Ramaphosa. There really is no way in which the SETA system can be reformed. And the whole idea of having this intermediary body makes no sense. We should go back to what we had before, that employers work out the training that they need, that they pay for it, but then they're able to claim a refund, a tax incentive from SARS. That encourages them to train more, and it's a cost-effective system. And that's what we should do once again. We also need to reform universities, where the numbers have gone up very sharply, from about 5.5 million to 1 million in 2023. The government wants to increase numbers to 1.6 million in 2030, not as high as the SETAs, where its aim is 2.5 million by 2030, but still a considerable increase from where we are now. And the state subsidy has nevertheless been kept too low. It's always been low by comparison with other countries. And in the face of this massification drive, it really is far too low. It's less than 1% of GDP. And the result of having ever more students, but not enough money, overcrowded lectures, not enough academic staff, and really falling standards. And what we also see, an inability of many students to pass. Throughput rates are really disappointing. What I mean here is that if you look at an undergraduate degree, which should take 3 years to complete, that 3 years is the regulation time. What proportion of students who enroll for that degree are able to complete it in the regulation time of 3 years? The answer is 17% in general. In the end, there will be a higher completion rate because many people will stay on, take more than 3 years. But it's wasteful. It should be done in 3 years, and we can't achieve that. And in STEM fields, it's even worse, with 11% in maths, for example, and 15% in ICT. So how can we reform universities? One essential is to raise the university entrance requirements. The government has set them very low because it has massification in mind, but this is not helpful to society or to the students involved. For society, there's an enormous waste in what is happening, that so many students come in but are unable to complete their studies. For the students themselves, it's an enormous disappointment, and presumably maybe a sense of personal failure too, quite apart from what the system has imposed on them. So we need to do better. We need to make sure that schooling is better so that all students are more adequately prepared for the rigors of university study. But we also should recognize that those rigors are there and make sure that we are selecting the students with the best prospect of passing in the regulation period. He also recommended that students should get income contingent loans from banks, which would be backed by state guarantees, because the state guarantee, the loans would be forthcoming. And they would cover all student expenses, tuition fees, accommodation costs, transport costs, daily stipends, books, and so on. And students would in time have to repay their loans, but they could do so over a period of 20 years, and only from the time when their earnings reached a specified threshold and they could afford the additional payment. And this is a system which is applied in other countries, including the United Kingdom, on the basis that university education is partly a private good. Obviously, it's a public good in the sense that if the country has a well-educated workforce, that is useful to the society and the economy. But there's also a private good element because graduates generally manage to earn more than others. So they are benefiting themselves from their university tuition. And so it is fair to ask them to pay for it at a point when they are equipped to do so. On this basis, we would also be able to increase state subsidies to 1% of GDP or perhaps more. It would be much easier for the fiscus to afford because the state would no longer be trying to pay the tuition fees and all other costs of the great majority of students at universities. And we should make sure that the ICL funding, the income contingent loans, and the state subsidies go to both public and private universities, because this will generate more competition. It will give students a greater choice, and universities will have to respond to attract students to come to them rather than some other institution. And competition makes for innovation and efficiency. Then we need to think about what are we doing with the rather scarce skills pool that we do have, and to recall what Deng Xiaoping said from China many years ago. It doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. We really need to use all the skills that we have, regardless of racial identity. Our skill shortage is so bad, we can't afford to exclude some schools. It just makes no sense. One of the things that the ANC has argued is that without the racial quotas, it will be very difficult for Black people to find jobs in the economy. That businesses, they imply white businesses will try to exclude them. But this makes no sense, and particularly if you look back in time, because Black skills have been in high demand since the early 1970s. This was still at the height of the apartheid period, but what happened was that after a decade of rapid growth in the 1960s, the apartheid government realized that the white skill base was too small to meet the needs of the economy. And so the National Party government began changing. First of all, they began putting more money into Black education and increasingly trying to equalize per capita allocations to Black and white education. And secondly, John Vorster, seen as one of the most rigid of the apartheid prime ministers, said to business that the government would no longer stand in the way of what they had long been asking for, which is that they should be able to tap into the Black skills base and increasingly see Black South Africans moving up the jobs ladder into ever higher positions. And that, with the government's blessing, is what began to happen in the early 1970s. And of course, it was a process, but it did see rising Black incomes, reducing racial inequality, rising Black consumer power, which became increasingly important. Many businesses recognized by the 1980s that their Black market was as important, if not more important, than the white one. So it's absurd to think that businesses now in 2025 would not have an interest in employing Black people. And it's simply an excuse that the ANC uses to try and keep its racial quotas in place. What we need, of course, is rapid growth. If we could get growth at 7% of GDP, which we can't so long as we have BEE in place, then we would have the economy doubling in size every 10 years. There would be enormous demand for skills. And if we have better schools and tertiary institutions producing people who do have good skills, then obviously they are going to be able to move into high-paying jobs, and we will get a virtuous circle of expanding prosperity. Excluding skills on ration grounds, by contrast, has actually harmed the Black majority. Just one way in which we can see that is what happened at Eskom, where Pravin Gordhan in about 2015 or 2016 lamented that there had been such a rapid changeover, that people with important skills had really been encouraged to leave, that people with less experience, less institutional memory had been brought in, and then the efficiency of the SOD had reduced because without institutional memory, without experience, it's very difficult to function at the same level. What we need to do is to provide real help to the disadvantaged by shifting from BEE to what we call Economic Empowerment for the Disadvantaged, or EED, and that the Institute has written about quite extensively. And it's a system that would liberate the economy, allow it to grow, and really also reach right down to the grassroots by empowering disadvantaged families with tax-funded schooling vouchers, health vouchers, housing vouchers, and so on. At this point, I would like to thank you, and also to thank the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, whose generous help has helped to make possible the production of this paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthea. I must say that is most enlightening. And what I find particularly appealing about it is its tangibility. This isn't moaning from the sidelines. It is actively understanding what has gone wrong, what has gone right in other countries, but also, I think, notably how market forces pressured even John Foster to accept that your sources of labor, the ease with which you can access productive labor, is critical to your economic health. And that isn't to say John Foster suddenly became a classical liberal or a non-racialist. It is just that the gravity of economic reality pulls in a very specific direction, and that is an all of the above inclusive approach to where you can get your productive labor, creativity, entrepreneurship, and skills development from. And I think that is a point that is easily missed. Let me now turn to the questions that we have been getting throughout the presentation. Thank you so much for everyone who's joined this morning. I can see quite a few familiar names. It is good to see you all again. Let us start with some of the questions that we can find here. And some of them are sort of statements with a questioning component to them. Let me take this comment from Stuart Pennington first. Learners at school should be streamed into grade 9 into vocational, technical, artisan, and academic with university potential, with the objective of a plus minus 20% ending up at university. The fundamental issue should be skills acquisition and employability. That seems sort of like the TVET suggested changes you speak of, is that we should ease these routes, not necessarily around the stigma of having a tertiary education, rather ensuring that people can go from a schooling education to an active role in a participatory economy, irrespective of whatever channels that might be. Would that be a fair way of looking at it? And what examples do you think across the world could be an inspiration for that approach?
And I think that what Stuart talks about, you certainly used to apply in the United Kingdom. It makes me think of the 11+ exam there. And at that point, people either went to a grammar school or to a different school. Germany, and I'm afraid I don't know enough about it very much, has a system where pupils at perhaps right about the same age, perhaps a little older, are sorted into academic and more technical streams. And our own government has talked about doing this too. There was a period when Angie Macheka was saying that one of the reforms that she would like to see introduced was precisely this kind of streaming, so that people who would, the smaller group who would be destined for university would be separated from the larger group, which would probably make more money at the end of the day in many ways, because there is such a demand for technical and various types of practical skills. But particularly so today, I think, as the economy modernizes and so many new types of skill come into focus. And part of what has held back this process is resistance from the left, a view that you're then telling some children that they're not as good as others, which of course is not true. But people are always different in their aptitudes and their interests. And it's very important that the technical vocational side of things should not be poo-pooed or looked down upon, because it's enormously important to the society, and it's in many instances more lucrative to the people involved themselves. It can offer a sure path to a good income instead of the hope of some sort of job after university, which may not ever transpire, because many of the courses at university may be fascinating, but they're not the ones that are in demand in the marketplace.
I must say, I remember speaking to a Ugandan colleague when I was at university, and she said that there's a very interesting stigma in South Africa, is that you have to go to university. That's the next upward step socioeconomically, and particularly from a generational perspective, is if your parents didn't go to university, it's up to you to go to university, and then that creates this sort of virtuous cycle. And she said that was quite opposite to her experience in Uganda, where the expectation was not to go to university. It was to become an entrepreneur, to open a business, or to go into the family business. And I think quite often just the way of thinking about what does participation in the economy look like would be a useful reconsideration that the skills pipeline could do with some adjusting. Stuart Duncan asks a very interesting question. There have been a lot of initiatives mentioned here. If you had a magic wand to immediately change 3 of them, which would you prioritize? Which is a frustratingly intriguing question that I couldn't resist asking.
Yeah, it is. I think I would probably, off the top of my head, prioritize the vouchers at the level of schools to begin with, basic schooling, because we have to get basic schooling right, or nothing else can become right. And it is astonishing if one looks at what James Tooley has written about the success of low-cost private schooling in many countries around the world. That's what gets it going. That's what improves academic results and performance overall. I think I would also want the vouchers to apply to the TVETs, so that the TVETs start having incentives to perform, accompanied by a big focus on this is the kind of education that is going to be much more valuable to many people in the marketplace. So it's to be valued, not looked down again. But I think too, in the employment sphere, we have to stop pricing poorly skilled people out of the labor market. So we need to get rid of the national minimum wage or bring it down very sharply. It is crazy for South Africa with its high levels of unemployment to adopt a national minimum wage, which is so close to the median wage, which means that so many people are actually working illegally because they're not complying with the national minimum wage. And we have the trade unions now wanting 20,000 labor inspectors to go out and stop this, which will mean job losses rather than job gains. So if I had to choose 3, I'd go for those.
Excellent. I must say it's a tough question, but I think a more than satisfactory answer. I quickly want to pivot to labor market flexibility. Now, in the paper, you highlight these job-destroying effects, and you've spoken now again about these minimum wage barriers, coercive bargaining council agreements. For a skeptic who would see in that case against the minimum wage only a sort of a cynical distraction of a compassionate labor policy, what would be the best link between lowering those barriers, the minimum wage, coercive bargaining council agreements, and job creation at scale? Because I think that would probably be the skeptic's response in saying that this is what's the link between these changes and job creation at scale?
I think they're the essential foundation for job creation at scale, and particularly taking into account the skills base that we have now. But obviously, it's not enough. And we're doing a series of papers on the blueprint for growth because it's a package of reforms that all need actually to interlink if you're to have the maximum positive output at the end of the day. But that's an essential. And we need to do then everything that we can to generate growth at the level which is necessary. And the more the growth rate edges up, and we could hope to get it to 2% and then 3%, that's already better than where we are now. But with a very singular focus on how did other countries get to 7%. And there are countries that have done that. And in fact, our own Trevor Manuel was part back in 2008 of a sort of international panel which produced something called the Growth Report, which looked, I think it was 13 countries that had managed to sustain a rate of 7% growth over a period of 15 years or so, and how had they done it. And there was a formula which they came to, but it required the right policies. It required an absolute recognition that the state must get out of the way, that you need to promote competition and innovation, and you shouldn't have the state trying to pick winners. You should be trying to encourage trade into other countries so that you're not relying only on your domestic market, but you're able to tap into the wealth of the world. You need to be sensible. And fundamentally for that, you need to scrap the national democratic revolution, which is what has put our economy into this complete policy straitjacket, in which the ANC, despite having lost its majority, is still pursuing it. It keeps assuring the very narrow group of ideologues who believe in the NDR that it's not giving up on that. But that's not what the great majority of South Africans want. We know from our polling that the great majority of South Africans are pragmatic, that they're sensible, that they aspire to sensible policies that will build the society incrementally and help them get ahead. So perhaps I should modify my 3 reforms. The first and foremost one is scrap the NDR.
Quite. It reminds me of explain God in 3 simple answers. It is a cruel way of going about it, but Mr. Duncan seemed satisfied with the answer. In terms of particularly intriguing bit of the paper is the special economic zones. Could you perhaps go into some detail for us and explain what are these special economic zones? Where in the last 50 years or so have we seen them work sensibly? And what would successful special economic zones look like for South Africa, would you say?
Well, I think the obvious success story is in China, when Deng Xiaoping said, we have to do what makes sense, what works. One of the key reforms was to set up special economic zones in China, and then really to allow sort of pretty much free market policies within those zones, still very much under the control of the Communist Party, but with an encouragement of foreign investment to come into those areas. And many investors did come, hoping that they would be able to tap into a very large Chinese market, but also knowing that wages would be lower in China than they would be in the US, for example, that you would be able, therefore, to manufacture items and export back to the US, that this was a cost-effective way of proceeding. But really, China's focus was on making those socioeconomic zones as attractive as possible to investors. And then critics of China would complain that they use various unfair mechanisms, falsely holding down the value of the currency, stealing IP and various other things in order to give more of a boost to the businesses. But the essence of the model was to take off the heavy hand of the state and allow the free market to function in those areas, which it did very successfully. And so that, more than anything else, is probably what helped to lift China, gave it that initial start. We have been trying to implement special economic zones for a number of years now. It's 12, I think, that we have. But they're really not doing very much. And a key part of the reason they're not doing very much, they're not attracting much investment. They're not making much of a difference to anyone. We have one in Kuko, for example. We have one near the Oliver Tambo Airport. We have them there's a Dubai trade port in KwaZulu-Natal near Durban. The trouble is that they're not different enough. There's some concessions which have been made in the SEZs, but too many of the same rules apply in the rest of the country. And yet the SEZs are by definition places where you can experiment with doing things differently. So there, certainly, we should be able to lift the labour laws largely and scrap the BEE requirements and just experiment perhaps with schooling vouchers in those to see whether you then get a number of independent schools coming up, that the fact that there are these good schools available in the SEZ becomes an attraction for both investors and people wanting to able to use them. We could just try and think out of the box and how the SEZs could be made into attractive areas. If we can't reform the whole country, perhaps we could start with SEZs.
We are nearing the end of this morning's session. I think I'm going to chance on three further questions. One is it comes from actually a few questions. It seems to be a theme that there might be skepticism about what these vouchers become on the ground. And Nkosinati Magagula says specifically, if the vouchers don't end up getting sold by some of the people who get them, in terms of sort of they become a parallel currency almost, what measures can be put in place to prevent that sort of shadow currency arising from these vouchers?
Well, I think one of the things is to make sure that the vouchers actually go to the school that the parents have chosen. So they don't go into the hands of the parent, but the parent will decide, for example, that he or she wants to send their child to, say, there are various chains in South Africa which have been experimenting with moving into Soweto and other township areas. If a school from one of those chains moved into your suburb, your part of Soweto, and you decided, right, that's where your child should go, then the voucher of the amount specified would go to the school. So you wouldn't get the chance to sell it to somebody else. But if you're unhappy, then you go the next year to a different school, and then you instruct. So ours, for example, would pay the vouchers then to the different school. So it would be a way of avoiding putting them in the hands of the people and who might be tempted in some instances to try and sell them off. And you yourself have also thought of various ways in which that kind of fraud could be countered. You've developed the Freedom from Poverty Bill, which would have various mechanisms against fraud. And perhaps you could just elaborate very briefly on those, if you can step out of your chair role for just a second.
Yes, no. So I think that the basic essential is to make sure that they go to the places that they are most needed, but also to make sure that you've got these controls that vouchers, as they are misallocated, would become a serious matter, and also that they get attached specifically to, for example, a particular child, that you can't just sort of exchange it for another voucher that isn't linked to the schooling of that particular individual. So there are quite a few ways you can actually sort of build this security into the system from both the sort of supply end and the demand end. But I think the fundamental of making sure that it empowers choice is the heart of the thing that determines how you can then secure it. The Freedom from Poverty Bill suggests quite a few ways to entrench this security, but at the end of the day, it's the buy-in that makes it appealing. And also fundamentally, I think what we should also just acknowledge is the fact that if we look at our polling data and if we look historically, we do not see always the reason for the paternalistic cynicism that people might use freedom or might use these choice infrastructures in perverse and bad ways, and that we have to sort of design the system to hedge against these. Actually, if you look at the data on the ground, even if you go to history and look at the post-slavery South, what you get is parents themselves not perhaps highly educated, themselves in quite often barbaric circumstances, not socioeconomically sophisticated, and yet they are the first deciders in a multi-generational chain of investing properly in education in numeracy and literacy. And I think Thomas Sowell's work on this is particularly revealing, is that from about 1860 to 1960, you get a century where the post-slavery descendants of former slaves, every generation became more literate and more numerate, and that upward chain of upliftment started when illiterate, innumerate slaves knew enough about life to know that they wanted their children to have an education, even though they never had it. So I do think you'll always get this question of abuse of resources, but that shouldn't overshadow the reality that most parents that I've interacted with, that we've polled, most parents indicate not the cynical application of shadow currencies for vouchers, but a genuine investment in their child's future. The second last question comes from our colleague Terence Corrigan, who I think asks, as is his wont, a very good question. What about the impact of all this on social cohesion? With all the societal ills, this is not simply an economic question. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think just to reiterate what I said earlier on, we have this extraordinary level of unemployment in this country, 8.4 million people on the official definition, something like 12 million on the expanded one. And this is a huge level of suffering. It also means that there's a great fragility at the heart of our society, that so many people are excluded from participating in the marketplace, from being able to earn their own living, from having a sense that life can get better for themselves and for their children. And that can make really, it can add to the sense of fracture within the society. It can disrupt the social cohesion of the society. Whereas if we can turn it around in all the ways that we're talking about, if we can see those hundreds of thousands of jobs being generated and people having the skills to move into them, then I think immediately there's a great sense of hope. And hope in itself would be good for social cohesion. And then, of course, the more the people do find themselves earning and being able to climb the economic ladder and having a sense of well-being, the better that would be for resisting the kind of fracturing of society, for standing together, for feeling stronger common bonds. So it's a crucial thing to tackle these problems of generating more skills and generating more jobs in order to improve social cohesion in South Africa.
And the data support that. When we ask South Africans whether they agree or disagree with the statement that with more jobs and better education, jobs and skills, the topic of this paper, do they see that as a route to eradicating racial and social inequalities? And a supermajority, always over 70%, agree with that. So I think social cohesion, if history tells us anything, is so often baked into a healthy economic functioning. And even with the question of xenophobia and the illegal immigration and sometimes the violence that flare up on that, quite often, if we study the trends, it seems to be connected to times of intense socioeconomic frustration. So if you can get the economy right, of course, you won't get everything right, but you create the environment for a more productive and, as you say, a more hopeful society that can really live up to that supermajority's agreement that jobs and skills are the key route towards social cohesion and eradicating these inequalities. A last question that I think I'm going to take a stab at in a rather undue abuse of the chair comes from Armin Miller. Says, great plan, but how do we get government to accept this? If not, it will only be a great plan like many others. Now, I think my answer would start with, what are we trying to do with these Blueprint for Growth papers? Are we just taking them to the politicians, to the decision makers? And my answer would be no. We genuinely try to go upstream from politics. If we think about what defines the scope of political debate, it is quite often what defines the scope of public discussion. And the idea that the Institute has operated on for many, many years is that societies change, the status quo collapses, you go from one paradigm to another, and then in that moment of uncertainty, when things change, the ideas that had been fed into the system with credibility, with visibility, and with sustainability will become the basis for the next paradigm and the next status quo. And the idea, therefore, of going upstream from politics is to speak to people like you, Armin, and to everyone listening to this morning, and the hundreds of thousands of South Africans who follow the IRR, who support the IRR. We are not pretending to be a go-between between the people and politics. We have a longer-term goal than that. We want to make the pragmatic, moderate majority of South Africa so informed, so potent upstream from politics that political parties, for the sake of their own survival, and governments, for the sake of their own survival, cannot but listen to the pressure of these pro-growth policies. And we've seen some success over the last year in particular. And we did some analysis on this, and this was part of why the Institute was recently honored to receive the Africa Award for the Atlas Network's recognition of projects that promote freedom. And that is that a year ago, when the GNU was established, one of its first goals and priorities was identified as economic growth. And in the months before that, we can see how the conversation of growth in news media and on social media really built momentum, and largely on the back of IRR publications, involvement, and public commentary. So if we can get the GNU over a relatively short period of a few months to make growth the number one issue of its statement of intent, and we can do that with the support of the people in this meeting and in this session today, then over the longer term, we can make that a greater success even more. Would you say, Anthea, that that is a fair answer to Armin's question of making sure that this isn't just another plan?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think this is always the challenge, of course, and but I think it's also important to recognize that the political environment is changing. As you say, that there are many people out there now with a hunger for reform. There are many people who have not stopped voting for the ANC a long time ago, and they haven't yet found another party, perhaps, they're altogether happy to support, give a majority to. But we don't need that, provided we get a stronger, the existing GNU that we have now and GNU in the future to be stronger still, at really being able to cut the damaging policies away. The ANC has been intent on a national democratic revolution. It's now lost its majority. There is already, I think, a capacity in the GNU, if all the parties that are in it would see a real need to address this crisis of unemployment in the country. They already have the power to start pushing back against what the ANC wants and to implement the reforms that are so clearly needed. And the more there's also a groundswell of opinion from the grassroots saying, yes, this is what we want, the more they will heed that, and it will have an impact on their interactions within the GNU. And ideally, we must get to the time, and I think we can, where the ANC is further cut down to size, the NDR is further rejected, the importance of freedom, economic freedom as well as political freedom as a foundation for prosperity is recognized, and that people then will turn more and more to the parties that espouse those policies, that want to get the economy growing, that want to embrace reforms of this kind.
And for case in point about how things have changed is I do think we can look at the VAT debate and realize that for 30 years, what the ANC wanted in a budget was the budget. And then with this GNU, it might not be a sea change, but it was perhaps a stream change where people could see that I voted for this party and I could see how they behaved when the issue of tax, bread and butter issues became the defining question in politics. So we should have hope. We should make sure that whoever needs to hear the message of this blueprint for growth does. We thank you for your time today, Anthea, and for this brilliant paper. As ever, it is excellently written. I would recommend everyone to go read it immediately. There's nothing within the next 45 minutes that could be more important than the reading of this paper. But if there is, find some time at a different moment. And I just want to reiterate our gratitude to the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, who made this report possible with their generous support. Finding the research, finding the numbers isn't just something that happens quite easily. It is intense. It is labor heavy work. And to do this paper on jobs and skills, to do the job, we needed some skills. And that is why CAS is such a wonderful partner to us, and we are so grateful. And if you want to contribute to more of these solutions so that they can go further, go faster, and so that we can truly build what South Africa can be, a country of economic and political freedom and prosperity, join Team What SA Can Be from the IRR's website. We look forward to having you on board. Anthea, thank you. And to everyone at home, thank you. We'll see you again. God bless.
Thank you, Hermann. And thank you to all the viewers.